So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being with us today. My name is David Etu, and I will be your host and presenter for today's webinar from Flare Systems. So basically today we're going to be spending about the next 30 or 45 minutes together. And the goal of our presentation today is to better understand what is DRP and who is it for. So we have been in this space for a number of years at Flare Systems. And our goal today is to share some of the lessons that we have learned and to help you kind of understand the market and also avoid what we call lemon services or companies that may not be up to par in terms of DRP solutions. So that's kind of the goal today. So the presentation is going to be divided into 4 different sections. So first we'll be talking about what is DRP, and then I'll be answering some of the questions that we commonly receive when we talk about DRP. So is my company too small? Is this appropriate for me? How can I best use this service? And then we'll talk about the questions that you should ask your vendors as to, well, what kind of service can you provide us? How open are you? And one of the main points I want to communicate today is that transparency is extremely important in the case of DRP. And finally, at the end of this presentation, kind of talk about how can you integrate these solutions and how best to maximize your return on the investment with these solutions. So to begin with, well, a few words about myself. So my name is David Etu. I'm the Chief Research Officer for Flare Systems. My background is actually in criminology. So I have a PhD in criminology. And I've been studying for the past 10 years online illicit markets and mainly focusing on their social networking and how malicious actors interact with each other and end up transacting and buying and selling illicit goods and services online, which is kind of counterintuitive because they're going to the dark web, they're going to places where they don't know anyone, and they're still sending hundreds or thousands of dollars to anonymous people in the hope of receiving something from them. So this is has been the things that I've been studying, and today I'm applying this to the problem of DRP and cyber threat intelligence. So to begin with, as I said, we'll look at some definitions or try to kind of narrow the scope of, what is CTI, what is DRP. We hear in cybersecurity, it's very common to hear all these abbreviations and these words, and we don't necessarily always understand what they mean. So I thought best just to make sure that we have all a common vocabulary that to define some of the words that I'll be using today. So the first thing is most people at least have heard of cyber threat intelligence or threat intelligence. And this is a graph that I picked up from Gartner, which is an industry analysis group. And this is very useful to understand what is and what isn't threat intelligence. And threat intelligence has been around for a number of years, and it provides companies with technical feeds, but also human-based intelligence to try and understand what are the threats that are active against your company. And so in this case, what companies that are active in the threat intelligence field are trying to do is to provide you with the context, the mechanism, the indicators, as well as the actionable intelligence that you can use about the threat to better understand what is this threat and how can you protect yourself against it. And so this intelligence is used to inform your decisions regarding what to do about any given threat and to make sure that you have the processes in place to protect you. And so the goal of threat intelligence is to provide you information about vulnerabilities before they even become a threat or even before they become an incident, which is even worse. In the best of scenario, this is what happens, but cyber threat intelligence can also be used to reduce the time to know, which means that if there ever was an incident that was targeting your company or that involved your company, what you'd like to know is instantly that that incident had happened, not 8 months later that someone had exfiltrated some data. And so cyber threat intelligence is really there to help you reduce the time to know and to let you know, well, if we can't proactively prevent this threat, at least help you mitigate the dangers and the impact by reducing the time that you need to find out that it happened. DRP, or digital risk protection solutions or services, the goal is a bit different, but also connected to cyber threat intelligence. And so this field comes out of cyber threat intelligence, and it also overlaps with it, but it also extends it. And whereas threat intelligence aim was to collect knowledge and disseminate this knowledge, with DRP, what we're actually trying to do is to protect your business assets and to monitor these assets, and that can be on the clear, the dark web, the deep web, and also on all cloud services to help you mitigate and remediate the problems that you may have. So the goal here is, as you can see in this graph, which is again by Gartner, to stop the bleeding. So basically make sure that whenever you have a problem, that we can prevent this problem. And there are many scenarios or many use cases for DRP. Here you have a few of them. So you have, account takeover, you have brand protection, you have technical data leakage, you have digital footprinting and fraud campaigns. I'll be touching a bit on those later on in the presentation. So this is kind of the full graph from Gartner. And what you see is basically that when you're talking about threat intelligence, it does overlap with DRP, because with DRP, what you're actually doing is collecting data, collecting intelligence, collecting information. But the goal is to be a bit more proactive and to be able to protect your company against these threats. And DRP, because of this difference, will be very useful for cybersecurity department, but it's also going to be very useful for other departments. So you may think about, for example, the marketing department, who would like to know, well, are there fake social media accounts for my company? Are some of my customers going to these fake accounts and asking questions, sending personal information? Is this fake account even just putting out messages that could damage my brand? So in terms of brand protection, DRP is extremely useful. We can also think about HR, who has to protect, for example, the data from their employees, or who is receiving a lot of documents, for applicants, for example. Well, it would be nice for HR to know, should I be on the lookout for malicious actors sending me malware-embedded documents? Are there employees outside of my company sharing on social media, once again, information, or on the clear web, on Facebook, or anywhere else? This is the kind of thing that DRP is able to provide, to help you with, and that will be useful, yes, for cybersecurity departments, but also for many other departments. And when companies are looking into DRP, one of the things that we hear a lot is that, well, DRP is not for me because my company is just too small. And that's something that we've heard many times in the past, and it's actually a very legitimate question. There's plenty of cybersecurity product and services that are not designed for companies of a small size. But what I want to communicate in the next few minutes is that actually the size of your company, it doesn't really matter when you're considering DRP. I really like this image because, it shows that many companies believe that they're, hidden from the road, that no one can see them. But actually, if you take some of these roads, what you're going to find is that it's pretty easy to see this house from the road. And we're not even talking about the malicious actors who would go off-road and try to find this house, which would be pretty true and pretty easy. And there is this kind of belief that you can hide yourself in the vastness of the internet. And especially with the latest technology changes that we've seen, it is getting harder and harder to scan the entire internet, something that could be done with more or less ease over the past few years, and to find these victims randomly. So it is getting more difficult to scan the entire internet. So it does provide you some level of protection, but it still doesn't protect you completely, and I'll say why in a second. The other belief that we often hear is that, because you're small, you're going to have a smaller attack surface, and it's going to be harder to find you. And this is really all true. But you have to remember at the same time that we're all part of the same network. And, we all know the 6 degrees of separation rule, which means that on average, you can get to anyone in the world, using 6 hops or 6 ties, and you're going to be connected to someone who's going to be in India, Australia, China, or anywhere else in the world, basically. And so because we're all connected within this network, this means that, we're going to be easy to find. Most companies are going to engage in business development, in marketing, and this is all going to be embedded into networks. And networks, just by their nature, they make it very hard to hide, and they foster connection. And then, trying to hide yourself in this context becomes very difficult, even if you're a small company. The other thing we also have to keep in mind is that malicious actors, one of their biggest and most important threat is that they're going to be opportunistic. So what I mean by this is that these malicious actors are going to attack whomever they can, basically. And there's no real reason in many cases why companies were targeted. There's always this kind of random effect as to why a company is targeted. And there's plenty of companies who don't take cybersecurity seriously, who don't have the best practices implemented, either because of lack of knowledge or because they don't have the resources or the time. And so there is this random effect into why some companies are going to be impacted and others not. But what this means is that even small companies are going to be targeted by malicious actors, just because they're out there and malicious actors will attack whomever they can. And for those who don't know, we recently published a report on ransomware, and we looked at what we call double extortion ransomware group. So that's kind of a mouthful, but basically, these are a subgroup of the ransomware groups. And their main characteristic is that before they encrypt all of your company's data, what they do is that they exfiltrate all of your data. And then they put up on their website a notice saying that they have all of this information, and they either ask you to pay a ransom or else they're going to release it, or sometimes they're just going to put it up for auction. And so they'll say, if you want to have your data back, well, you can just buy it from us, and you have to be careful because other people could be out there trying to buy it. And this could be malicious actors, it could be competitors. And so these groups, they're really interesting because they provide kind of a double threat against your company. And what we did is that we looked at these groups, there's not that many of them, and we indexed all of their victims' information. So we went to their website, we looked at the information that they threatened to publish, and then we tried to learn a bit more about all of their victims. And the chart that you see over here is actually the distribution of their victims. And that was really interesting because the group that is the most exposed to these double extortion ransomware groups was actually the companies that had between 50 and 200 employees. So some relatively small companies. And the big companies, if you look down in the graph, what you're going to see is, the 10,000 plus, the 5 to 10,000 plus employees, they were not all that targeted by these groups. And one reason why we don't see large companies being targeted by these groups is that they're a harder target. So, trying to attack a large bank, a government, is difficult, and very often it will be much more easier to attack a smaller company. And this is what we see over here. Of course, these small companies also have other characteristics that are of interest to malicious actors, and I'll be getting back to this in a second, but there is a clear correlation between being a small company and being targeted by these ransomware groups. Now, of course, if you're a small company and we try to do an investigation or review of your exposure, it commonly happens, I just took this company completely randomly. And what you see is that, for this, American company, what you see is that in our own database, we have the results. And this is very often what you're going to see for small companies and when you're talking with DRP solutions. And when you do kind of a one-off check of what is going on with this company, you're going to see that there's no actual threat right now. But what also happens is that this can change pretty quickly over time. And this is another SMB that I looked up in our systems. And what you can see is that, if we had talked to this company in the first half of 2020, there was barely any mention, really no mention of this company anywhere in our database. But this really changes over time. And what you see over here is that actually the number of threats and the risk that we've detected for them over the last perhaps 4 or 5 months has increased dramatically. And so even if you don't have a lot of threats against you at some point in time, it doesn't mean that that's going to stay like this forever. And so this is very often fueled by the fact that the malicious actors are very social. That's something I say pretty much in all of my webinars and presentations. And that once they find a suitable target, you can bet that they're going to share this with other malicious actors and that they're going to target that company as well. And so what we're going to see is if someone finds, for example, an electronics store where it's pretty easy to use stolen credit cards to buy computers, you can bet that this store is going to see a drastic rise in the number of illicit purchases and fake purchases, just because malicious actors will talk to each other and then they'll say, hey, you should try and buy computers on that website. It's pretty easy. And they don't check for stolen credit cards, for example. Now, another reason why small companies should be concerned with DRP is because of the partners that they have. And so I'm going back here to our ransomware report, and this is a posting on a ransomware group that had exfiltrated data from one of their victims once again. And if you look at the fine print over here, what you actually see is that this small company was actually providing services for very big companies. And in this case, they're talking about SpaceX, the space exploration company, as well as NASA. And because this company was providing services to SpaceX and NASA, it meant that they actually hold a lot of confidential information from these large companies. And so what we've started to see is actually these malware groups targeting not the big companies, the big juicy targets, but going after the much smaller companies who actually have the same information they're looking for, but not as protected as in a large company. And so we've seen anything from accountants, law firms, and even cybersecurity companies being attacked because of their privileged relationship that they have with these very interesting targets. And this is one of the things that you see over here. And so does this mean that, as a small or medium business, you should, cover in fear because of all these malicious actors? Absolutely not. The point here is that actually there are, solutions that can help you, that can help protect you, and that, hiding and, hoping that no one targets you is a solution. It is an option, but depending on who you are connected with, because of this network effect, once again, if you are connected to high value companies, it is very likely that malicious actors will find out and that they will target you specifically. And if they don't target you specifically because of this, then it is likely that they will go after you just opportunistically, just when they have the opportunity. And so the goal here is just to be prepared and use the right tools for the right solution, depending on who you are. Now, a second question that we get asked is basically, well, DRP is really nice. I think I'm the right size for this, I understand this, but it's just too complicated for my company. There's no way I can handle this type of product. And it's true that, cybersecurity is a hard problem, and there are multiple ways that malicious actors can infiltrate your company. Here I put in 4 examples that are relevant for DRP solutions. What you may find, for example, is seeing some malicious actors using phishing attacks, so sending you phishing links, trying to get into your systems, trying to compromise username and passwords from your employees. Another thing that you might see is what we call drive-by compromise. So basically, one of your employees visiting a website, and just by the fact that they're visiting a website, well, they download some malware on their computer, and that starts infecting your company. We also see supply chain attacks. So this means that you're going to go and download a well-known piece of software. It can be Firefox, it can be Chrome, but because malicious actors manage to hack the company distributing this software, they can actually inject their malware into this piece of software. And lastly, what you find is, for example, vetted accounts being sold. So basically just people buying on the dark web or the internet, username and passwords for your corporate networks, and then getting into your company. And so this cybersecurity problem is a very complex problem, and it's difficult to see, well, how can I manage this problem using DRP? Is this, too much for me? And, this is a hard problem, And that's even before we talk about human errors. And so in this case, what we talk about is your own employees, just because of lack of time, just because of immature practices that are responsible for the infiltration of malicious actors. And so what we found, for example, is misconfigured cloud services is going to be a common problem. We just put up a blog post about this new situation with Docker Hub, which is really interesting, which talks about the errors that can happen when companies change their policies and their free tier in particular, because many employees are going to be using free services online. But when these don't become free, you have to scramble and find an alternative. And this is when mistakes can happen. You're going to see employees who are using cloud services that are not set up, they're not sanctioned by your IT department, or even people who are going to be sharing documents online with the right access are not managed properly. So all of these combined together invite malicious actors in. And once again, this is not because employees want to harm your company. This is just because problems are going to happen, and randomly, once again, people are going to come in. And DRP solutions right now have become quite sophisticated. And one of the perk and one of the thing that we and many others have been trying to do is to make these a lot less complicated. And so basically these solutions now, what they require is to learn a bit more about you to be able to protect you. And so today when you're looking at these digital risks, well, they're going to attack a very narrow number of items that we need to know about to be able to protect you. And so we're going to see, for example, domain names. So people who are going to be setting up phishing campaigns. Well, if you want to detect the phishing campaigns, we need to know what your domain names are. If we want to protect, your company, we need to know what is the name of your company, what is the name of all of your subsidiaries, as well as the name of all of your executives. And so in this case, what we need is a bit of information about the names that we should be looking for, your infrastructure, so the IP addresses, for example, and finally, some custom keywords, regular expressions, various things that we can look for in all of our database. And so when we're talking about DRP, it can be something that's very daunting. How can I protect against all these risks? Well, it's pretty simple. All you have to do is provide us kind of a profile of information about who you are, and then we handle the rest. So that's pretty easy. The one thing I will add here is to remember my previous point, which was about partners and small companies and their ties with larger companies. It's extremely important to do this exercise, yes, for you, but also all your third parties and partners that you interact with. Because what you want to know is what are your risks, but what also are the risks of everyone who's connected to you and who has information that you want to protect. And so this is where it becomes really important to ask and to survey your partners and your third parties so that you have all these information that you can use for them. Now, once this is set up, you kind of kick back, relax, and then you wait for all of these real-time alerts to come in. And so DRP solutions, you may think it's pretty complicated running all of these queries, but most of the work is actually handled by someone else, which is your service provider, basically. And what you want to do is set up these alerts that are going to be in real time and that are going to alert you when stuff that is important comes in. And so it's important to have a service that can help you, for example, group alert, send them to different people, make sure that you receive them at the right time. Also being able to open and close issues depending on what is happening. But basically the situation with these DRP is you may think it's a complicated problem, and it is protecting against risks. But the good news is that as long as you know who you are and who your partners are, there are people who can handle the rest. The third point I wanted, or the third question that we get asked very often is, well, if my company tried DRP in the past, well, all we did was just burn through way too many resources. And I mean, that's a given with anything that's cyber threat intelligence. You can spend days looking at Bitcoin transactions, looking at forum posts. There's always new threat actors to profile. There's new risks to evaluate. And at some point, I mean, you can burn through an endless amount of resources trying to understand what are the threats out there without really having kind of a sense for, am I secure? Have I built a big enough profile of all the risks and all the threats? It seems like it's something that is never ending and that you have to start over and over and over again. And one of the problem is basically what we call unactionable intelligence. And here you have a perfect example of this. So this is a malicious actor who's advertising a method to crack someone's voicemail. And if you remember from a couple of years back, the big scandals in the UK and the US, all the naughty pictures that were stolen using these voicemail, all of the private information that was stolen, people went to jail because of this, because of these, hacked voicemail. This is a major problem. Now, when you look at this listing or this, advertisement, well, you're left with this sense of, okay, so there may be a problem with my voicemail, but what do I do? And there's very little information to go on as to, well, what should we do? And this is where this vague threat turns into you reading forum posts, you trying to query many databases, trying to find out as much information as you can about these, hacking a voicemail, and yet you're likely not to find anything that's going to be credible. And so what do you do with this listing, and do you spend a lot of time trying to figure out what this problem is? This is where the DRP that is not going to be very useful for you is if it's providing this type of unactionable intelligence. The other problem that you're going to find is this deluge of real-time alerts. So for most of our customers, what you see is basically this. You're going to have kind of a steady number of alerts coming in every single day, and then all of a sudden you're going to see jumps. So you're going to see a big increase in the number of alerts. And very often what you're going to find out is that, well, it's not because all of a sudden there's a lot more risks. Maybe someone decided to post a kind of repetition or duplicates of their listings. Maybe there's someone who's stealing someone else's listings and then they're posting twice about it. But with these DRP, this actionable, with this intelligence that you're collecting, it can become very problematic, and you can burn through a lot of resources if you don't have help to manage these jumps in real-time alerts, basically. The other thing is when you are attacked and when there is an incident, and when you're looking at for example, this is a ransomware, an attack from a ransomware. Well, who is this malicious actor that is targeting you? Who is this group? Are they serious? Is it true when they say that if I pay them, I'm going to get decryption keys to get my files back? Is it true that there's no other way of getting my data back than paying them? So when you look at these questions, you can spend a lot of time and energy burning through them with your company. And basically what you want to have is the good DRP solution that will help you kind of get the answers pretty quickly. And so there's many ways and many things that these solutions are going to do for you. And one of them is just looking, at the feedback and the reputation that you can find about these malicious actors online. And so, it's providing you with the right context for the problems that you're facing. And this is an extremely important part of it. And this is one of the pieces that will reduce the resources that you need to invest. And so when you're looking at a new threat actor, for example, and trying to find out, well, is this person serious? Should I trust this person when they say that they have a way to hack into my databases? Well, if you're looking at these feedbacks and you're saying that this person is providing a good service, probably that this threat is going to be credible, and then we need to kick into action and to see, okay, what other context we have about this person that could help us understand what this threat is. And this is where correlating data across multiple sources is going to be very important. And so one of the ways that this can be done is actually by connecting the identities of the malicious actors on different platforms, even when they're using different usernames. And there's many tricks that you can use to do this. I'm happy to answer any questions you have about this at the end of this webinar. But a very efficient and good way of collecting intelligence is to see where someone is active and getting all this information pulled together. Another thing that will be pretty useful is looking at generating new intelligence. And so this is a case where we find, for example, a PGP key associated with an account on an illicit market online. And what you see is that embedded or connected to this PGP key is actually an email address. And when you Google this email address, you can actually get a lot of information about who this person is. And so, yes, you can run through a lot of resources, but being able very quickly to validate and to get context around a malicious actor is extremely useful and will significantly reduce the number of resources that you need to handle the threats. The other thing that you need to consider and to really understand is actually how can you prioritize, these real-time alerts and this intelligence that you're getting. And there's many ways of going about it. This is our own way of going about it. But basically what you want to do is to have a process in place to make sure that you can distinguish between something that is not really important and something that is very important. And so an example of this is, in Pastebin, what you're going to find is lists of thousands of domain names. Well, even if your domain name is mentioned in these lists, not necessarily all that important. So it's basically a score of 1 in this scale. But if you go to a domain name that's mentioned because it is next to a MySQL database username and password, then this becomes a lot more problematic. And this is especially important because when you're seeing these surges of alerts, these surges of activity, this is perhaps where you can actually tweak the scale and adjust the level of things that you're going to be looking at to focus on the things that are most important and to make sure that you don't lose track of the items that are the most important, even when you have a lot more alerts. And resources are always going to be constrained, that's for sure, compared to what you would need. But basically, even though you're always going to find more intelligence to study, more intelligence to look into, and more malicious actors to evaluate, then you have people on staff, well, it's still important to be smart about how you react and to use the best tools to actually extract the context, prioritize the alerts that you're getting, and make sure that you actually get the most value. And here you have to remember that these malicious actors that are targeting you, they're actually all working together to target you. And we need to do actually the same and organize our response as much as the malicious actors are organized. And why have malicious actors been so effective at attacking companies so far? It's because they are organized in this criminal underground that has proven to be quite effective. Well, if we were to do the same and organize ourselves, we could significantly improve the quality of our defenses. And so I would say that, given what I've said so far, whether you're small or you're a big company, there are many things that you need to look into, and DRP can help you answer many of the questions that you have. But there's also questions that you have to ask your vendors and to ask yourself also as to what you need and what type of service are you getting. And we have been talking a lot about the coverage of your intelligence in the past, and that's a point that's extremely important to look at. When you're looking at DRP and cyber threat intelligence platforms, it all comes down to the data that you're getting and the value that you can extract from this intelligence. And so many vendors are going to advertise just the bold number of sites, for example, websites that they're collecting data from. And that is an important number, don't take me wrongly, but it's also important to look at other factors. And so this is kind of a 3D graph of what to ask or what to look for. And the point here is to say, well, there are going to be multiple platforms that, you should be fetching intelligence from. And so this can be the dark web, the clear web, the deep web. It can be chat rooms. It can be domain name feeds. It can be SSL registration feeds. It can be, all types of websites and all types of resources online. And you need to draw intelligence from all of these because they're all going to be feeding you with different type of intelligence. Now, across each of these platforms, you also need to have as many sites as you can. So if we're talking about dark web forum, well, collecting from only one forum doesn't really make sense, but it also makes sense to be having a lot more of these, but do not be kind of forgetting about all the other platforms. The last point I want to make is to ask, how many authenticated platforms are you on? And this is very important because on most websites, you don't get much intelligence unless you enter a username and a password. And in some cases, you have to pay to get into these platforms. Other cases, you have to be invited in. But this question of authentication is extremely important because the most valuable intelligence is going to be behind these authentication walls. And if you don't go behind these walls, well, the quality of data you're going to get is going to be much lower. Now, this is where you ask, what kind of coverage do you have, but also how transparent are you willing to be? And the glass is always going to be half full for all companies. I mean, collecting data on all malicious actors on all of the internet for all companies is basically impossible. There's just way too much stuff going on at the same time. And so it becomes really important to, first of all, know kind of what are the targets or the specialization of your providers, and to understand, well, where are you collecting data from, and do you specialize in one area? And I think it's important to choose someone who will focus on our own needs. So if you're, in Europe, having a provider who specializes in European data is going to be important. If you're in Canada, it's going to be the same. But also even looking at your domain of activity, at your industry, making sure that someone's going to be focusing in your industry to get the best quality information there is. And there's wide discrepancies in the level of quality depending on where you are, where your company is, and the type of industry you're in. A good fit with a company may not be a good fit with a different company. The other thing also is that you're going to need to know how transparent they are about how often they collect data. And that's something that's going to be very important, because maybe you collected data from a website once. Does that mean that you have this threat covered? Not really. You have to be there every single week, every single day, every single month. And then if your provider isn't willing to give you kind of a level of assurance about how often they'll be going back to that well, then you need to ask questions about how protected you really are with this service. Another point to look at is how holistic are the competencies of the vendors. And so it's basically trying to understand, well, DRP can mean a lot of things. I mean, we're talking about data leakage detection, fraud campaigns, account takeover, brand protection, digital footprint. These are very different activities. And yes, they're all based on intelligence, but then they all take very various forms. And so some vendors are going to be extremely good at account takeover, others are going to be good at brand protection, and not everyone's going to be able to be good at everything. And so this comes down once again to the industry you're in, the region you're in, and trying to understand, well, if I have a lot of accounts that I want to protect, maybe this is kind of the key information that I want to protect against. And maybe I can find then the best provider that will, yes, provide me protection against fraud campaigns, brand protection, but also will focus on this account takeover thing. So to make sure that we focus on the right problem, basically. And I also need to ask them, well, how can you help me remediate these digital risks? And so a large part of DRP is actually helping the customers trying to prevent the problems or mitigate the problems once they've happened. And so in this case, it means having the right context and helping your company understand, okay, so we have this information, this intelligence. What does it mean for me? What can I do about it? And if I do what you're telling me to do, what will be the impact on me? And so, for example, when you're looking at technical leakage, so if you're looking, for example, at passwords, API, access keys that are going to leak on source code repositories like GitHub, for example. Well, there are some ways that you can eliminate these access keys from your source code repository that will leave traces that malicious actors can take advantage of. And so you need to know exactly how can you remediate this problem, but you also need to revoke the keys that were published and create new ones to make sure that even if someone had access to these keys, they can't use them anymore. And so it's all of these small little things that need to be integrated into the platform and really help you make the most of the service. Now, lastly, and this is a very important point, I said earlier that when you're looking at malicious actors, they all collaborate with each other. They're part of this criminal underground, and they're going to share their knowledge, they're going to share their tactics to be attacking companies. Well, one of the things that you need to ask your vendors and DRP solutions is, well, how can you help me better collaborate? And there's two places where they can help is better collaborate internally, but also externally. So even internally, having cases, being able to manage all the alerts coming in, being able to say, I've looked at this person, at this threat actor, he's not serious, we don't need to learn more about this person. And so you can close this issue to make sure that someone else in your organization is not wasting time looking at the same intelligence and repeating the work that you were doing. And also externally, that's something that we're seeing more and more of is having companies collaborate with each other. So if we see, for example, a malicious actor targeting bank A, well, if this actor is targeting bank B also, maybe bank B would have information that it could pass on to bank A. And so having these networks and helping companies collaborate with each other and helping you understand, well, is there someone I could ask for help with this problem without giving out, too much information? I think this is something that, these DRP vendors and these solutions should be empowering you to do, is to understand who can help me out there and to make sure that I am as organized as the malicious actors attacking me. And so when you're going to be looking at integrating these solutions into your own cybersecurity processes, what you're going to find is actually that DRP is going to provide you with the context, prioritization, and it's going to provide you kind of two types of data. And we're seeing customers who are trying one, trying the other, trying both. And this is kind of the fun thing with DRP and cyber threat intelligence, is that you can actually play with it in multiple forms. And in some cases, what you're going to see is the automation is going to be playing a very big part of it. One of the things that we've seen, for example, is collecting information about stolen accounts or hacked accounts. And so on chat rooms, what we find is malicious actors posting a lot of screenshots about the accounts that they have hacked. And so this becomes really interesting because you can take these screenshots, send them to your customers, and they actually have the account numbers that have been hacked. And then you can start an investigation internally about what happened. And so you can automate all of this process to make sure that you have a feed of, account takeovers, victims. So these can be employees, these can be customers, this can be third parties, as well as your vulnerable infrastructure, and making sure that this integrated with all of your security feeds that you already use and feeding them to your systems. And the other way that you're going to be looking at this is also through the real-time alerts. And this is where this is maybe a bit more by hand, where you receive the prioritized alerts. And this is where you create cases with individual accountability and where you actually take the time to say, well, we have this issue over here. We'll create a case. We'll use a platform to manage these cases and make sure that we can follow through and assign this information to someone. And this becomes very powerful because it helps you understand, well, today I'm going to have, three prioritized alerts, three things that are going to be very important. How can I assign them to people? How can I help them manage it? And make sure that we can ignore these results in the future and make sure that we don't go back to this well unless we think that the threat has changed and that we need to look at it once again. And I think that no matter if you integrate these services and these solutions, automatically through automation or by hand with these real-time alerts, the one thing, and I'm repeating myself again, I know, but it's basically just to organize ourselves and make sure that we all collaborate together to be able to provide kind of an effective response to malicious actors who are part of organized crimes groups. So I believe this is kind of all the questions that we had for today. So I want to thank everyone for being here. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. It was really a pleasure to have you with us. I hope you learned a few things today. And we'll be back next month for another webinar. And I hope you all have a nice, even though snowy day. So enjoy your day and we'll talk soon. Bye-bye.